In our previous lecture, we covered the setting of Plato's Crito, a jailhouse dialogue between Socrates and Crito on the question of whether Socrates ought to avoid execution by escaping prison. We saw Socrates lay the groundwork for how he and Crito should approach this question by arguing that they cannot simply rely on majority opinion. Rather, it is a philosophical discussion alone which they must rely upon for an answer. It is the verdict of this philosophical dialogue between himself and a cherished friend that must decide Socrates' fate. Specifically, a philosophical dialogue on the vital question of what justice demands of us. Socrates and Crito's disagreement about whether Socrates should escape from prison has thus far focused on whether it is acceptable to do injustice for the sake of avoiding a material harm. In this case, the purported injustice is escaping prison, and the material harm in question is death. Socrates' answer to this question is clear. Committing injustice is never justified. The most important thing is not merely living, but living well. As we saw previously, to live otherwise is to put the health of our soul in serious peril. Importantly, Socrates has secured Crito's agreement with these claims about the relationship between the health of the soul, justice, and the good life. Socrates tells Crito that, in the light of these agreements, we should examine whether or not it would be just for me to try to get out of here when the Athenians haven't acquitted me. And because of these fundamental moral agreements that they say they share, the answer they give to this question must be dictated by what is just. If it does seem just to escape, then we should make the attempt, and if it doesn't, we should abandon the effort. We can see why justice should be a primary concern. If the health of our soul requires acting justly, and a good life is impossible with a corrupted soul, then determining what justice requires is vitally important. In this passage, then, the question Socrates and Crito are focusing on shifts significantly. From this point forward, they will no longer focus on the demands made by the majority. Instead, they will focus on the demands of justice. Regardless of what the majority may think, what is the right thing to do? To escape from prison, or for Socrates to accept his death sentence? Before we examine how Socrates answers this question, we should pause briefly to notice something else about this passage. One thing we should notice here is that Socrates tells Crito that they should act in whatever way seems to be just. And given the topic of their discussion, this brings up a very important question. If the majority disagrees with our course of action, then is it enough for us to act in the way that merely seems just to us? In the present situation, Socrates believes that he should remain in prison and accept death, even though most people, the majority, would take the opposite point of view. So, should Socrates trust his own reasoning abilities over common consensus about this important matter of life or death? Considering this question has broad implications for how we approach situations of moral uncertainty, and you can find further discussion of this point in a video entitled On Doing What Seems Just, which is linked in the description section below. Socrates and Crito have resolved to take whatever course of action is best supported by philosophical argument. Notably, many would argue that escaping from prison is justified because the city of Athens wronged Socrates in the first place. Escaping prison, then, would simply be justified retaliation for an injustice that Socrates has already had to suffer. Socrates, however, rejects this view with an argument that I will refer to as the argument from Justice Absolutism. We will begin by examining the first half of the argument, which runs as follows. Premise 1. One should never intentionally perform an act of injustice. Premise 2. If one should never intentionally perform an act of injustice, then one should never do justice in return. Conclusion. One should never do injustice in return. We will start by examining the principle that this argument is based upon. I term this principle the Justice Absolutism principle, and this principle is expressed in premise 1 of the argument. Socrates asks whether it is always wrong to do injustice intentionally, whether it is never good or fine to perform an unjust act. Is it really possible that at their advanced age, they have now become no better than a pair of children? Let's consider this comparison further. Children tend to instantly retaliate in like fashion against whoever offends them, and of course this often causes a downward retaliatory spiral. This is why parents often tell children that 2 wrongs do not make a right. This parental correction implies that, in any circumstances, injustice must be bad and shameful for the one who does it. The qualifier "in any circumstances" underscores the unconditional nature of Socrates' commitment to justice. Not even retaliation can justify injustice. This is precisely what the Justice Absolutism principle claims. One should never intentionally perform an act of injustice. Premise 2 simply draws out the consequences of the Justice Absolutism principle. If one should never intentionally perform an act of injustice, then one should never do injustice in return. If it really is the case that one should never do injustice, then it must also be the case that one shouldn't do injustice in return for injustice, no matter how commonly this opinion is held. Even if someone does wrong by us, that does not justify us in doing something wrong to them. What is wrong, whether that wrong is done in response to injustice or not. This gives us the first conclusion of the argument. One should never do injustice in return. This conclusion implies what we can call the principle of non-retaliation. One must neither do injustice in return nor wrong any man, no matter what one has suffered. Justice is not conditional upon the wrongs that have been done against us. Now, the majority may reject this conclusion, but they can only do so on the pain of rejecting the principle of Justice Absolutism. But how can it ever be right to do what is unjust? Doesn't the very concept of injustice itself signify something outside the bounds of morality? While there is strong intuitive appeal behind the claim that retaliatory injustice is always wrong, it may also seem that this claim puts the permissibility of certain widely accepted practices into doubt. What does the principle of non-retaliation imply about the status, for example, of self-defense? About defensive wars fought to protect the innocent? About punishment in the criminal justice system? These questions pose interesting issues that I do not have the space to address here. For further discussion of this, see the supplemental lecture entitled Authority, Punishment, and Non-Retaliation that is linked in the description section below. After arguing for non-retaliation, Socrates pauses to make sure Crito is completely comfortable with giving his agreement to this principle. He wants to ensure that Crito is not agreeing to anything contrary to what he really believes. There are a few reasons for this. First, Socrates recognizes that relatively few people accept this principle. Most think a person is entirely justified in retaliating against injustice with injustice. Second, Socrates believes he must secure Crito's agreement with this principle since, Between those who believe the principle of retaliation and those who don't, there's no common basis for deliberation. Productive discourse will be impossible without agreement on this point. In fact, not only is agreement required for cooperative dialogue, but it is necessary to prevent the interlocutors from regarding each other with contempt. It is pointless to continue further if Crito cannot accept all the consequences of Justice Absolutism. As such, Socrates posits that the starting point of our deliberations must be the absolute nature of justice and its implied principle of non-retaliation. Specifically, the claim that it's never right to do injustice or to do injustice in return or to retaliate with bad treatment when one has been treated badly. This starting point places important constraints on the direction their discussion can take. If the principle of retaliation is not the starting point of deliberation, then Crito could argue that Socrates isn't obligated to act justly. Even if Socrates has extremely compelling arguments for why escaping prison is unjust, Crito could simply counter that these arguments are irrelevant. After all, why must we act justly in the first place? If, on the other hand, the principle of non-retaliation is the starting point of deliberation, then Crito must argue for the moral permissibility of escaping prison. Giving their accepted starting point for discussion, Crito would have to contend that, in this case, there is nothing unjust about disobeying the government. No other consideration can be relevant to their deliberation. Socrates' escape is either just or it is not just. Fortunately, Crito does agree to make this the starting point of their deliberation. After urging Crito to be honest if he no longer believes justice is absolute, Crito does affirm this moral commitment. He stands by Socrates and shares with him an absolute commitment to doing what is just. The idea that moral deliberation requires a common basis is not just important for this dialogue. It is a concept that has important implications for moral philosophy more generally. Although there is not adequate space to cover these implications here, further discussion of these points can be found in a supplemental lecture entitled Moral Discourse and a Common Basis for Deliberation, and this lecture is linked below. Let's now examine the second half of the argument. This portion of the argument adds one additional premise. If Socrates were to escape prison, then he would be doing injustice in return by breaking a just agreement. This, along with the previous claim that one should never do injustice in return, produces the final conclusion by modus tollens reasoning. Socrates should not escape prison. A claim which Socrates seems to believe follows straightforwardly from an absolute conception of justice. Deriving this conclusion requires showing that escaping prison is an instance of doing injustice in response to injustice. To demonstrate this, Socrates introduces a concept which will become critical later in the dialogue. He asks Crito whether one should do the things one has agreed with someone to do, provided they are just, or should one cheat? Crito concedes that in fact we should uphold our agreements. But what follows from this? Socrates contends that if we leave this place without having persuaded the city, then we are treating some people badly, notably those who we should least of all treat in that way. More specifically, the act of leaving the city would treat another poorly by failing to stand by just agreements. Socrates clearly believes escaping from prison is unjust because it breaks some sort of agreement. However, beyond this, the present passage leaves many important questions unanswered. First, with whom has Socrates made an agreement? To whom did he make a promise that now requires him to remain in prison? Second, whoever this individual is, why is this who we should be the most scrupulous to avoid wronging? Why is this who we should least of all want to treat poorly? Finally, notice that Socrates emphasizes that the agreement in question is a just agreement. So what makes an agreement just? And what makes this particular agreement just? As we proceed, we will see how Socrates answers these questions. He will identify who he has made the agreement in question with, explain why this entity deserves our highest respect, and, given these points, provide an account of why the agreement made with this entity is legitimate. We should have these questions in mind as we examine the arguments in the second half of the dialogue. One reason most people, or the majority, would believe that Socrates would be well within his rights to escape from prison is that escaping prison appears to be a victimless crime. Who exactly is harmed if Socrates escapes to another city instead of being executed? What difference does it really make? Recall that the jury at his trial would have been perfectly happy to give Socrates the sentence of exile if he had only shown more contrition. I believe it is for this reason that we see a significant rhetorical shift at this point of the dialogue. Instead of making arguments in his own voice, Socrates expounds his arguments in the form of a speech given by the laws of the city. Consider again the passage where Socrates impresses upon Crito the gravity of harm they would do by escaping prison. Socrates tells Crito that if he leaves without having persuaded the city, then they will be treating some people badly, and not just some people, but those who they should least of all want to wrong. The phrase some people is critical here. As just mentioned, even if it would be unjust for Socrates to escape prison, there does not seem to be any identifiable specific persons who Socrates would be harming. So why does Socrates use the phrase some people? Socrates is attempting to reframe how we think about breaking the law, to get us to stop viewing it as a merely abstract violation. Instead, Socrates personifies the laws so that we conceive of legal transgressions as harm done against the laws themselves. Henceforth, the law will no longer be portrayed merely as a system for regulating behavior, but as a quasi-flesh and blood entity capable of admonishing us, benefiting us, and even suffering harm. We can see this from how Socrates talks about the laws in subsequent passages. First, from this point forward, the word laws is capitalized as if it were a proper name. In addition, Socrates portrays the laws as capable of performing actions normally attributed to persons. For example, Socrates has Crito imagine being confronted by the laws. Here we imagine the laws calling us forth to give an account of our actions. Significantly, this is just the sort of situation we would imagine ourselves to inhabit if we failed to obey an authority figure like a parent, teacher, or a courtroom judge. We are called to explain our behavior to a person with the authority to correct, admonish, and perhaps even punish us. Furthermore, not only can the laws confront us, they can also be harmed by us. Socrates has the laws ask how he and Crito can think it is justified to intentionally attempt the destruction of the laws. This sets the stage for the speech of the laws, in which Socrates talks to Crito in the voice of the laws themselves. specifically in which the laws are imagined to reprimand Socrates and Crito for even entertaining the possibility of disobedience, and they explain why such disobedience is unjust. A fundamental claim made by the laws is that their authority and even the city itself cannot be preserved if citizens are permitted to ignore their commands. The laws ask, do you think that a city can continue to exist and not be overthrown if the legal judgments rendered in it have no force? What will happen to the city if the laws are deprived of authority and undermined by the actions of private individuals? Socrates urges Crito to consider how they could respond to this question. What gives them the right to attack and even destroy the law, to act in a way that undermines the very basis of civil association itself? Is their only response that the laws first treated them unjustly? Despite Crito's earlier agreement that their discussion must be founded on an absolute commitment to justice, Crito claims that this must be their response. Crito would have them respond that they are permitted to break the laws because those very laws treated Socrates unfairly first. Has Crito gone against his prior commitment to Justice Absolutism? Is he now claiming that two wrongs actually do make a right? Not necessarily. Instead, Crito might be pointing out the consequences of the city's unjust judgment of Socrates. Previously, there may have been some type of agreement in place between the city and its citizens, making it wrong for Socrates and Crito to disobey the laws. Now, however, the laws have voided that agreement by mistreating Socrates, and consequently freed Socrates and Crito to disobey the laws as they see fit. The idea is that when the legal authority itself breaks the law, then the citizen is no longer bound by a duty of justice to uphold the law either. If so, then disobeying the law in such circumstances does not violate the Justice Absolutism principle. Sometimes breaking the law simply isn't unjust. Whether this reasoning is sound ultimately depends upon the nature of the supposed agreement between the state and its citizens. How does the agreement come about? What are the terms of the agreement? What is the basis of that agreement's authority? For their part, the laws clearly do not think that the agreement has been rendered null and void, and their response emphasizes two different aspects of this important topic. First, the laws ask rhetorically whether disobeying in return for unjust treatment was part of the agreement Socrates made with the laws. The clear implication is that this was never part of their agreement at all. The agreement never granted citizens a right to disobey. What is needed here is a better understanding of the nature of this agreement. And to acquire this understanding, there are a few questions we need to focus on. Is there an agreement between the state and its citizens in the first place? Obviously, Socrates cannot violate an agreement that does not exist. Furthermore, how, when, and in what manner was this purported agreement made? Secondly, the laws make a claim about the nature of their authority. However the agreement came about, it is clear that the laws take that agreement to grant them an absolute authority. They believe Socrates agreed to stand by whatever judgments the city rendered. This idea also poses its own set of philosophical questions. Do citizens living under a legitimately recognized political authority have an absolute duty of obedience? Is disobedience ever permissible? These are the questions we will keep in mind as we examine the substance of the arguments found in the speech of the laws. The speech of the laws covers many topics. However, it is possible to distinguish two main lines of argument within the speech. We will cover one of these arguments in this video, while the second will be reserved for the next lecture. The first of these is the argument from paternal authority. We will begin by looking at premise 1. This premise states that the city of Athens has fulfilled duties of paternal support towards Socrates. Understanding this premise requires an understanding of what is meant by duties of paternal support. Duties of paternal support are exemplified by the kinds of responsibilities that parents have to sustain their children and assist in their development toward adulthood, making sure their children are fed, clothed, sheltered, and educated. Premise 1 makes the claim that these specific services have been provided to Socrates by the city. The city has taken on duties similar in nature to the duties of a parent. But what exactly are these duties that Athens has fulfilled towards Socrates? The laws give a few examples. It was they who allowed for Socrates' birth by establishing the marriage of his mother and father. Just as parents are directly responsible for a child's existence, so the laws are, at least indirectly, responsible for Socrates' existence. And importantly, the laws get Socrates and Crito to admit that they have no complaint about such laws. The implication here is that it would be hypocritical of Socrates to take advantage of this beneficial law and then later decide that he will disobey the law when it is no longer useful to him. Furthermore, the laws also provided for Socrates' education. Specifically, the laws required his father to educate him in the arts and physical training. Again, the city is playing an indirect role in enabling what is done directly by parents. And once again, Socrates readily admits that these were beneficial policies. Socrates does not take issue with the paternal support that the laws provided him. Now, let's consider the second premise. If some person or persons, A, has fulfilled duties of paternal support towards some person or persons, B, then A has paternal authority over B. This premise introduces a critical concept for this argument. This is the concept of paternal authority, from which the argument derives its name. This notion is closely related to the idea of paternal duties. Hand in hand with the duties that parents have toward their children comes a particular sort of authority that parents also hold. And crucially, this authority is unique in many respects. Compare parental authority to, for example, the authority a teacher has in the classroom. Teachers do have a certain kind of authority over students. However, that authority is far from being absolute, and it does not extend into the personal areas of the student's life, but pertains specifically to the teacher's educational duties. This is not true of parental power. At least while the child is a minor, the parent's authority is nearly absolute and extends to almost all aspects of the child's life. Depending upon the child's age and maturity level, the parent may be responsible for when the child goes to sleep, what the child eats, who the child can associate with, and how he or she can spend money. This kind of authority is not found in almost any other context. Before continuing, we should take some time to delve into this concept in a little more detail, since it is central to the argument. Specifically, when does a relationship of paternal authority occur? And what is the particular character of such authority? There are 4 general characteristics we can identify with paternal authority. First, the individual with paternal authority must possess some level of superiority. The justification for why paternal authorities have such wide latitude to make decisions for those in their charge is, at least in part, that the paternal authority possesses something that those under that authority do not. There are, for example, many respects in which parents are superior to children. As adults, parents have superior intellectual capacity, ability to think about long-term consequences, and also greater life experience. Second, paternal authorities are not only superior over their charges, but they are responsible for them as well. Paternal authorities are not necessarily and should not be tyrants wielding power for personal gain. They are supposed to use their superiority for the good of those they are responsible for. We have already discussed the myriad parental duties parents have toward their children. And it is this which provides the basis for premise 2. It is because some individual has fulfilled their paternal duties that they then have the right to wield paternal authority. The third condition deals with the means a paternal authority must have at their disposal in order to fulfill their paternal duties. To understand this, compare the paternal authority of a parent with the authority of an employer over an employee. The employer does have authority over the employee. Within limits, the employer can require that the employee perform certain tasks during a certain duration of time. However, the employer does not have any natural authority over the employee. The employee has voluntarily agreed to the employment arrangement and is being paid for their time. The employer wouldn't have any authority at all without this agreement, and the employee can leave this arrangement if they choose. However, that is not true of the authority a parent has over a child. Although being under the parent's authority is beneficial and even necessary, the child never chooses to be under that authority. It is no more within our power to choose who our parents are than it is within our power to choose whether we have parents in the first place. The authority of a parent over the child simply does not arise from voluntary agreement. As a consequence, those who wield this type of authority have greater latitude to override their subordinates' autonomy. An employer can limit the free choices of their employees to some degree within a work context. A parent, however, can limit the free choice of their child even about decisions of the greatest personal importance. As such, a defining characteristic of paternal authority is that those who exercise this sort of authority often have the right to override the autonomy of those subordinate to it. Finally, relationships of paternal authority require something of the subordinate as well. Despite placing severe limitations of freedom on the subordinate, paternal power also does produce real benefits. It is through the paternal power of parents that children have their basic needs cared for and receive guidance during a crucial and formative period of life. Importantly, this involves great personal sacrifice on the part of parents. As such, it is only fair that this relationship also imparts certain duties upon the child, specifically, duties of loyalty and respect toward their parents. Whether the child necessarily agrees with all of his or her parents' decisions or not, it is thought that children have a duty to respect those decisions as well as the authority from which they are made. Here, of course, we can clearly see an echo of the law's claim that Socrates has no right to retaliate against them. It is this type of authority held by those with superior wisdom and experience which the second premise sees as accompanying the fulfillment of the duties of parental support. In their speech, the laws draw this inference explicitly. Because the laws are responsible for Socrates being born, brought up, and educated, it follows that Socrates is both the offspring and even the slave of those laws. The word offspring, of course, invokes the comparison with a parent-child relationship, and it would be hard to think of language that more strongly indicates inferiority than the word slave. As such, the laws urge that whatever justice demands of citizens in relation to the city, those demands cannot be based upon equality. Because the laws and the citizens are unequal, a citizen cannot be justified in doing in return what the laws have done to the citizen. Just as justice in the relationship between a father and son or slave and master is not based upon equal reciprocity, so neither is the relationship between the laws and the citizens founded upon that basis either. And of course, the crucial claim here is that the justification for this inequality lies in the paternal support provided by the laws. Importantly, the superiority of the laws excludes them from being subject to any real limitations. Even if the laws attempt to destroy Socrates, which is precisely what they are attempting to do at present, believing that doing so is just, Socrates still isn't warranted in attempting to destroy his fatherland and its laws. If Socrates takes the Justice Absolutism principle seriously and believes that the laws hold a position of superiority over the citizens by virtue of their paternal responsibility, then retaliation remains out of the question. That is, if Socrates and Crito, by agreement, really claim to be men of virtue. If paternal authorities deserve our loyalty and respect, then disobeying such authorities must be morally suspect. From these two premises, we can derive the first conclusion of the argument. The city of Athens has paternal authority over Socrates. We should take a moment to understand the implications of this conclusion. This conclusion underscores the comparison between the authority of the laws and the authority of parents. Parents are superior to children, responsible for their well-being, empowered to override their autonomy, and deserving of loyalty and respect. Likewise, according to the present argument, the government is superior to the citizen, responsible for giving citizens paternal support, warranted in overriding or even wholly disregarding the citizen's autonomy, and deserving of the citizen's absolute obedience. In fact, upon this conception, the citizen should behold the state with a sense of respect and even reverence. Whatever feelings a son should have toward his father should also be expected of citizens toward the laws, and perhaps to an even greater degree. This conception of government will likely seem foreign, at least to some extent, to the modern reader. It would likely seem to the modern reader that it is illegitimate for a state to claim such a degree of absolute authority. That might be right. However, we should at least recognize that whatever is commonly thought by the modern person, something like this was the dominant conception of government for most of human history. The history of Europe, for example, is replete with kings and queens who claimed absolute power, at least in theory, even if their power was never quite so absolute in practice, and they claimed it as a divine right afforded to them by God. While there is a rebellious spirit in human nature, there is also an obedient one. Throughout history, many forms of social organization have existed where power was recognized in an unchosen civil authority which claimed absolute sovereignty and, to put it mildly, very much discouraged individual dissent. And there is even something entirely natural about this view of authority. The first contact we have with authority comes through the family. As a child, we are taught to recognize the inherent right that parents have to rule on behalf of their children. It is only natural, then, to recognize the authority of the government upon a similar foundation. Although, admittedly, this foundation runs counter to the basic political instincts of modern people living in liberal democracies. We can now turn to the final conclusion of the argument. We need to ask, what are the implications of the city having paternal power over Socrates? How does this obligate Socrates to act toward the city? Answering this question requires examining the third and final premise of the argument. If some person or persons, A, has paternal authority over another person or persons, B, then B must either 1. Persuade A to change its commands, or 2. Obey A's commands. The first conclusion of the argument established that the city has paternal authority over Socrates. This premise explains what that means for the citizens of Athens, in particular, what it means for those citizens who may disagree with one of the city's laws. Those subject to a paternal authority have two options when they disagree with that authority. They can either persuade that authority to change its mind, or if they cannot do that, then they must obey. This, of course, very much entrenches a power imbalance between the citizen and the state. The decisions of the city, right or wrong, are authoritative. So if a citizen does not want to follow one of those decisions, then he must persuade the city to take another course. And that means that if the city remains obstinate, then the citizen has no other recourse. He can either follow the command or suffer the punishment for disobedience. And as we should expect, this imbalanced power dynamic is founded upon the claim that we should revere and respect the city's authority. The laws tell Socrates that his fatherland is more worthy of honor than his mother, father, and ancestors. The city and its laws are something to be revered and even something sacred. As such, the dutiful citizen treats the city with piety and placates to its demands, even more than the demands of his own father. All of this has a specific implication for the duties of the citizenry. As the laws indicate, this implies that every citizen must either persuade the city or else do whatever it commands. And this has come to be known as the persuade or obey doctrine. It is this doctrine which serves as the final conclusion of the argument. Socrates must either 1. Persuade the city of Athens to change its commands, or 2. Obey the city's commands. Given this conclusion, the citizens will often be obligated to submit to the government's commands whether they think those commands are just or not. And this is described in the following passage. The laws tell Socrates that he must be mindful of his behavior and undergo whatever treatment the law prescribes for him, whether that is a beating or whether it is imprisonment. The same is true if the laws deem it necessary to send Socrates to war, where he might be wounded or even killed. This requirement upon Socrates, as a citizen subject to the laws of Athens, is absolute. He must do whatever his city or fatherland commands, or else persuade it as to what is really just. And of course, all of this is justified by the comparison with paternal authority we have been examining. While it is impious to violate the will of your mother or father, it is yet less so than to violate that of your fatherland. This passage neatly sums up the basis of the argument from paternal authority. If we think it is wrong, even impious, to disobey one's parents, then shouldn't we think it's even worse to disobey the authoritative commands of one's city? It is important to think about what accepting this doctrine implies about Socrates' particular situation. The persuade or obey doctrine permits only one path of recourse for those who disagree with the city. They must persuade the civil authority to change the command or law in question. Socrates, of course, had such an opportunity during his trial. He had the opportunity to convince a jury of his fellow citizens that the charges brought against him were unsubstantiated. However, as we saw in the Apology, he failed to do so, and as a result, the jury sentenced him to death. Therefore, since Socrates has failed to persuade Athens to take his point of view, if he accepts the persuade or obey doctrine, he would be obligated to obey the state. And in this case, that would mean remaining in prison and submitting to his impending execution. Socrates would be forced to take the obey option in the dilemma presented by this doctrine. If you are like many modern readers of the Crito, then the paternalistic and authoritarian notion of government that Socrates puts forth through the voice of the laws will likely strike you as rather foreign. It may perhaps seem like a bygone relic of a pre-modern age. That is true to some extent. However, I think this argument also brings out an aspect of the nature of law that is as true today as it was in the time of Socrates and Plato. I provide further discussion of this point in the supplemental lecture entitled Persuading, Obeying, and the Authority of the Law, which is linked in the description section below. At present, however, we have covered the first major argument that Socrates makes in the speech of the laws. We will cover the second major argument, the argument from just agreement, in the next lecture.